A grave digger on the Baltic coast earned 2 thalers on the 2nd of March 1784 for putting into the ground a man his whole town had failed to name. The bell ringer collected 12 marks for tolling the bell. The plot itself, tomb number 1, inside the church of St. Nikolai in Eckernförde, cost 10 thalers, and that money bought 30 years of rest. 30 years. Rented ground on a lease like a shopfront. The parish clerk who recorded the burial had a problem, and you can feel him working around it in the wording. He did not know who the dead man was. Nobody in town did. So he wrote, in careful church German, that they had buried the so-called Count of Saint Germain and Weldon. So-called. In a burial register of all places, where the entire job of the document is to state plainly who has died. A few lines further down, the clerk added the sentence that has trailed this story for 2.5 centuries. The man in tomb number 1 had dined with the King of France. He had been handed a private laboratory in a royal chateau and 100,000 francs of the king's own money. He had run a secret peace negotiation in the middle of the bloodiest war of his century, moved through the courts of London, Paris, Vienna and St. Petersburg under 6 names, and convinced some of the sharpest, most cynical people alive that he was hundreds of years old and could not die. Voltaire wrote a line about him to the King of Prussia that people still quote today. Casanova sat across a dinner table from him and spent pages of his memoirs trying to work out what he had just watched. And he died broke. When the town inventoried his estate, the total came to 82 Reichsthalers and 13 shillings, a packet of paid bills and receipts, some razors, some combs, a pair of tinted spectacles, buckles, stockings, gloves, 14 linen shirts, and toothbrushes. No jewels, no gold, no manuscripts, no diaries, no letters explaining anything, not even a violin, and he had owned one all his life. The money did not stretch to cover his own funeral. The town buried the deathless man for free, as a courtesy to his patron. So that is where we are going today. The Count of Saint Germain, a man whose birthday, birthplace and true name were never confirmed by anyone, and who, for a good stretch of the 1700s, apparently had no age either. People called him the Wonder Man. Frederick the Great's court called him a riddle. He called himself at various times at least 8 different things. Before we get properly into it, a quick hello. Welcome in, whether this is your first video here or your 50th. Do me a favor and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, because I know a lot of you put these on in the dark hours and I like knowing how far these travel. A huge thank you, as always, to the patrons and the YouTube members. If you'd like to join them, every link to support the channel is sitting down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, get comfortable, top up whatever you're drinking, and if you're doing dishes or driving through the dark somewhere, even better, this one suits that. Depending on who you choose to believe, the story ahead covers somewhere between 90 years and 4,000. Back to the man nobody could name. Since we can't begin with who he was, we can begin with what people called him. Over roughly 4 decades he moved across Europe as the Marquis de Montferrat, as Count Bellamar in Venice, as the Chevalier Schoening in Pisa, as Count Weldon in Milan, as Count Soltikoff in Genoa and St. Petersburg, as Graf Zeroghi in the German lands, and finally, near the end, as Prince Ragozzi. The name Saint Germain settled on him sometime in the early 1740s, and if you push it into Latin it becomes Sanctus Germanus, the Holy Brother. His contemporaries guessed at everything else, and their guesses tell you how completely he had scrubbed his own trail. Horace Walpole, who watched him operate in London and wrote about him with that catty, precise attention Walpole brought to everything, listed the theories going around town. He is called an Italian, a Spaniard, a Pole, somebody who married a great fortune in Mexico and ran away with her jewels to Constantinople, a priest, a fiddler, a vast nobleman. Walpole's own verdict after watching the jewels and the manners and hearing him play was that this had to be a man of quality who had been in the church or meant for it, and he added a line I've always liked. He was too great a musician not to have been famous, if he had not been a gentleman. The languages made him harder to place, not easier. He spoke French, German, English, Italian, Spanish and Portuguese, and witnesses in each country swore he spoke their tongue like a native. Some accounts add Russian, Hungarian, Arabic, even Sanskrit, though the further you get from people who actually met him, the longer that list grows, so take the exotic end of it however you like. People who saw him write claimed he could produce 2 identical letters at once, one with each hand, and lay them on top of each other so the words matched line for line. His memory worked the same way. He could hear a page recited once and give it back days later, word for word. Whatever else he had been trained expensively by someone. One more detail from Walpole's letter, the loneliest sentence anyone ever wrote about him. Walpole says the man professes that he never had any dealings with any woman, and the record backs that up across his entire life. No marriage appears anywhere in it, no children either, and in a century when every courtier's affairs were public sport, nobody ever named a lover of his. He flirted beautifully. He charmed whole salons of women. He handed out beauty water and compliments, and he went home alone for what looks like 60 straight years. Whoever he was hiding, he hid him from everyone, in every bed, in every country, until the day he died. Now, the origin theories. His contemporaries and the writers who came after them built quite a pile, and each version hands him a different mother tongue, a different religion, and a different reason to disappear. One school, pushed by the Marquis de Créquy, said he was an Alsatian Jew named Simon Wolf, born in Strasbourg around the turn of the century. Another made him a Spanish Jesuit named Aymar, another a Portuguese Marquis named Betmar. The encyclopedias for a long time settled on a Portuguese Jew, full stop, no name attached. A more romantic line said he was the natural son of the widow of Charles II of Spain, fathered at Bayonne by a banker named Adenero, a child of a discarded queen who could never be acknowledged. And the showman P.T. Barnum, who collected these theories the way he collected everything else, favored the version where the Count was the illegitimate son of an Italian princess, born at San Germano in Savoy around 1710, with a tax collector named Rotondo standing in as the official father. Pick any of those and the shape is the same. A boy born on the wrong side of a blanket or the wrong side of a border, raised on money that could not say where it came from, taught to never, ever answer a direct question about himself. The Count himself, across 40 years of dinner parties and interrogations, gave nothing. He joked or slid the subject away toward ancient Babylon. Then, at the very end of his life, sick and tired in a cold town by the sea, he told one man one story. His last patron, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, wrote it down in his memoirs. It is the only account we have from anything close to the Count's own mouth. He told Charles he was the son of Francis Rakoczy, the exiled Prince of Transylvania, by Rakoczy's first wife. He said that as a very small child, he had been placed in the care of the last of the Medici, Gian Gastone, the final Grand Duke of Tuscany, and that the old Duke had kept the boy so close he made him sleep in his own bedroom. And he explained his name. His two brothers, he said, had made their peace with the emperor, submitted to Vienna, and been given new identities under the protection of saints' names, one becoming Sankt Karl, the other Sankt Elizabeth. So the third brother, the one who never submitted, chose a saint's name of his own. Very well, he said, then I will call myself the Holy Brother, Sanctus Germano, Saint Germain. The name half of Europe knew him by, if this account holds, was a private joke about two brothers he had lost to the enemy, carried in plain sight for 60 years. Charles, to his credit, did not swallow it whole. He wrote, I cannot in truth guarantee his birth, but that he was tremendously protected by the Duc de Medici, I have learnt from another source. So the Medici connection, at least, had a second witness behind it, and Charles was a serious man, a governor, a soldier, a grandson of a king of England, writing decades later with nothing to gain from the lie of a dead friend. And here is where the story stops being a parlor puzzle and turns dark. Because if the Rakoczy account is even partly true, the Count's childhood sits inside one of the most brutal family histories in Europe. The Rakoczys were the great rebel dynasty of Hungary, and the Habsburg Empire spent a century grinding them down with a viciousness that is hard to overstate. Start with the grandfather, Peter Zrini, grandfather of Francis Rakoczy through his mother's line, was arrested for conspiring against Vienna and beheaded in 1671. The execution went badly. The headsman needed several strokes to finish the job, hacking at a living man's neck in front of a crowd, while the first blow's damage kept him conscious. His head and body went into the ground, and his family's lands went into the emperor's pocket. 16 years later came Eperjes. In 1687, an imperial general named Antonio Carafa set up a special tribunal in that Hungarian town, and over months worked through a couple of dozen Protestant nobles and wealthy citizens suspected of sympathy with the rebels. Worked through them slowly. Men were racked until their joints separated, burned with irons to draw out confessions everyone knew were worthless, then taken out to a scaffold in the main square where they were beheaded, quartered, and hung up in pieces on the town gates. The scaffold stood for months. People had to walk past the drying quarters of their neighbors to get to market. Vienna meant it as a message to anyone whose blood ran close to the Rákóczis, and the Count, if he was who he finally said he was, carried exactly that blood. Francis Rákóczi himself, the supposed father, lived the sequel. His own boyhood ended when Vienna took him from his mother after her fortress surrendered, handed him to Jesuits, and raised him as a hostage with a new, tamer identity. As a grown man, he was betrayed, arrested, and locked in the fortress of Wiener Neustadt, in the same complex where his grandfather had been butchered, awaiting what everyone assumed would be the same blade. He escaped in a borrowed dragoon uniform, got across the border, and in 1703 raised Hungary in the Great Rising that carried his name for 8 years. When it collapsed, he went into exile, first in France, later in Turkey, and he never came home. He died on the Sea of Marmara, still writing letters about a country he would never see again. Now look at his children, because this is where the Count's story slots in, if it slots in anywhere. Rákóczi's sons were seized by Vienna, stripped of their family name, and raised under invented ones, exactly the saints' names the Count described on his deathbed. And Rákóczi's will mentions an eldest son, Leopold George, officially recorded as dying at the age of 4 around the year 1700. Officially. The theory that has floated around this story for a very long time runs like this. A family that had watched Vienna behead its grandfathers and confiscate its children had every reason in the world to hide an heir, and the cleanest way to hide a 4-year-old from an empire is to bury him. Stage the death, hold the little funeral, let the imperial spies tick the box, and slip the living boy to a friendly court far away. To Florence, say. To an aging Medici duke with no heirs of his own, who might keep a small refugee so close that the child slept in his bedroom, and the duke in question repays a glance of his own. Gian Gastone was the last male of the Medici, the dynasty that had bankrolled the Renaissance. And by the 1720s he had given up on nearly everything except his bed. He ruled Tuscany from that bed for years, unwashed, half-drunk, surrounded by a paid rabble of favourites, a kind man by most accounts and a wreck by all of them, and when he died in it in 1737, the line that had produced popes and queens simply stopped. If a hidden Rákóczi boy really did pass his childhood in that palace, then his first great protector taught him 2 lessons without meaning to: that a famous name is a target painted on your back, and that even the mightiest families in Europe can be extinguished down to one sad bed. The grown Count behaved for 90 years like a man who had learned both by heart. If that reconstruction is right, then the earliest event in the Count of Saint Germain's life was his own funeral. A false coffin, presumably weighted, presumably wept over in public by people who knew it was empty, while somewhere a real 4-year-old was learning that his name was a thing that could get him killed. Every strange habit of the adult man reads differently in that light: the refusal to name his parents, the compulsive aliases, the wealth with no visible source, in an age when Rákóczi gold was known to be sitting in foreign banks under false names. The lifelong pattern of getting close to kings and vanishing the moment anyone official asked a direct question. You do not have to believe any of it. Plenty of careful people don't. But it is the one version of his origin that explains the fear, and the fear, once you start looking for it, is everywhere in his story. One German memoir, written by someone who knew him in his final decade under the name Graf Zarogi, adds the detail I find hardest to shake. The writer says the old man was always specially glad to speak of his childhood and of his mother, and that he never mentioned her without emotion, often with tears standing in his eyes. If one could believe him, the memoirist adds, a little dryly, he had been brought up like a prince. An old man in his 80s, the most famously unreadable person on the continent, a professional keeper of secrets for 60 years, and the one thing that reliably broke through the performance was his mother, whoever she was. He never said her name either. From that hidden childhood, wherever it happened, the trail goes completely dark for decades until it surfaces, of all places, in a police file. London, December 1745. And the timing could not have been worse, because the man with no name and no papers chose to be a mysterious foreigner in England during the exact weeks England was tearing itself apart looking for spies. That winter, Bonnie Prince Charlie's Jacobite army had marched out of Scotland and pushed as far south as Derby, about 120 miles from the capital. London panicked. Shops shut. There was a run on the Bank of England. Wealthy families loaded their plate into carriages, and the government started sweeping up anyone who looked foreign, moneyed, and unexplained. Our man qualified on all 3 counts. He had been in London about 2 years by then, dripping with diamonds, receiving large remittances from nobody knew where, refusing to say who he was, and, fatally, some letters were found in his possession. He was arrested on suspicion of being a Jacobite agent. That suspicion, in 1745, carried a very particular meaning. The law for treason in England still ran on the medieval tariff. A convicted traitor was dragged to the place of execution, hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive, castrated, cut open, and made to watch his own bowels burned in front of him before the beheading and the quartering. Within months of the Count's arrest, the machine was running at full capacity on the captured rebels. Francis Townley and 8 officers of the Manchester Regiment went through the entire ritual on Kennington Common in July of 1746. They were hanged for a few minutes, cut down breathing, their hearts torn out and thrown into a fire while the executioner shouted to the crowd, and their heads were parboiled and spiked on Temple Bar, where Londoners rented spyglasses for a halfpenny to get a better look at the faces. The heads stayed up for years. People ate their lunch under them. The captured Jacobite lords got the aristocratic discount, meaning only the axe. In August of 1746, the Earl of Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino were beheaded on Tower Hill in front of thousands. Kilmarnock went quickly. Balmerino's executioner needed 3 blows. The following spring, old Lord Lovat, 80 years of age, went to the same scaffold, and so many spectators crammed onto a wooden viewing stand that it collapsed under them, killing, by the reports, as many as 20 people who had come to watch a death and got their own instead. Lovat, waiting beside the block, is supposed to have found this funny. The more mischief, the better sport, he said. Then he put his head down and it came off in one stroke. The Count's arrest fed straight toward that machine. A foreign man with jewels, secret letters, unexplained money, and no name he was willing to defend, in a year when men had been drawn and quartered on far less. And he talked his way out. He sat through his examination, admitted freely that Saint Germain was not his real name, declined to provide a better one, insisted the letters were innocent, and somehow projected enough wealth, breeding, and unbothered confidence that the authorities decided he was an eccentric rather than an agent. Nothing could be proved. They let him go. Walpole reports that after his release, the Count was actually taken up by London society with more enthusiasm than before, dining out on the story of his own arrest. The man had looked into the room where they burn your intestines in front of you, and he came out of it with better dinner invitations. Walpole's full sketch of him from that season is the earliest close-up portrait we have. "The Count," he wrote, "sings and plays on the violin wonderfully, composes, is mad, and not very sensible." Mad, in Walpole's usage, meaning extravagant, theatrical, too much. The wardrobe backed the diagnosis. Witnesses in London describe a man in unrelieved black, no colour anywhere, and against all that black, diamonds. Diamonds on his fingers, diamonds on his shoe buckles, diamonds on his watch, his snuff box, his sword hilt, a walking constellation, and no banker in the city could say where a single stone had come from. He was received everywhere, examined everywhere, and explained nowhere, and the aristocracy of England, having failed to hang him, settled for seating him at dinner and staring. One more London thread before we cross the Channel. The music, the single part of his legend that survives on paper in a form you can still touch. During that same season of panic, 1745, an opera called L'Incostanza delusa ran at the Haymarket Theatre Saturday after Saturday, and some of its songs were his. He composed. He published. A body of his music still exists, 6 sonatas for 2 violins and bass, solo violin pieces, English songs, dozens of Italian arias, and modern scholars have gone through it and put out editions you can play today. Musicians who look at it describe it as elegant, competent, fashionable work, the product of a genuinely fine training. And his violin playing was another order of thing entirely. Witnesses across 40 years kept reaching for the same image, that when he played alone it sounded like several instruments at once, and one admirer wrote flatly that he played like an orchestra. Rameau himself, the greatest French composer alive, is counted among the people who admired him, and we will come back to Rameau, because the old man is about to say something that changes this entire story. In 1749, the Count gave a pair of private performances in London, and a young aristocrat named Lady Jemima York sat through one of them and wrote down her impressions. She was entertained, she said, by him or at him the whole time, meaning she could not stop laughing at the oddness of his manner, before landing on a phrase historians have been borrowing ever since. "I can't but fancy he is a great pretender in all kinds of science, as well as that he really has acquired an uncommon share in some. A great pretender who also genuinely knew things." 22 words, and it is still the fairest one-sentence summary of the man anyone has produced. Now, Rameau. Somewhere in these years, the composer, by then an old man, mentioned something in passing that lit the fuse under everything that follows. Baron von Gleichen, a diplomat who knew the Count well and left one of the most level-headed accounts of him we have, wrote that he heard Rameau, and separately an elderly relative of a former French ambassador to Venice. Both testify that they had known Monsieur de Saint Germain in Venice in 1710, and that in 1710 he had looked like a man of about 50. Do the sums yourself, quietly, the way Paris did. A man of 50 in 1710 would be pushing 90 by 1750. The Count standing in front of Paris in 1750 looked, by every witness, somewhere in his 40s. Dark, upright, vigorous, dancing at balls and playing his violin half the night. Two respectable old people with no reason to lie, no coordination between them, and no profit in it. Both remembered the same unchanged face from 40 years earlier. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained that testimony. You can reach for a father who resembled him. You can reach for failing elderly memories. You can reach for a man who simply aged remarkably well and encouraged the confusion afterward. And people at the time reached for all three. But that is the seed. Everything else, the 4,000 years, the dinners with Babylon, grew out of two old Parisians squinting at a face and saying, "I know him, and he has not changed." By around 1748, the Count had crossed to France, and within a few years he was inside the innermost circle of the most dangerous social environment on earth, the private apartments of Louis XV at Versailles. The man on that throne is unusually well documented, and he was strange. Louis XV was drowning in a boredom so heavy his own courtiers wrote about it like an illness, and his one reliable conversational enthusiasm was death. He liked to talk about corpses, sickness and funerals. He would ask perfectly healthy courtiers where they intended to be buried. Riding to the hunt, he once made his companions detour so he could look at a fresh grave. A king with that particular hunger handed a guest who hinted with a smile that he had watched centuries go past and remained above the reach of the churchyard, was never going to let that guest leave. And he didn't. The Count received rooms, favor, and eventually something extraordinary, a suite and a fully equipped laboratory at the Royal Chateau of Chambord, plus, by the reports, 100,000 francs to pursue his experiments, mostly in dyes and pigments. The King of France, in effect, funded the mystery. For what happened inside that circle, our best witness is a woman who was paid to be invisible. Madame du Hausset was chambermaid to the king's mistress, Madame de Pompadour, and she kept a journal, and her journal is generally treated as one of the more trustworthy documents of the whole reign, precisely because she was nobody, with nothing to sell. She watched the Count operate at close range, and she wrote down what she saw, including the single demonstration that hooked the king completely. Louis produced a diamond of middling size with a flaw running through it, and told the company it was worth 6,000 livres as it was, and would be worth 10,000 without the flaw. He handed it to the Count and asked, half joking, whether he could do anything about it. The Count turned it over, examined it carefully and said, "It may be done. I will bring it back to you in a month." A month later, to the day, he returned the stone. The flaw was gone. The weight, when they checked it, was barely diminished. The king sent it to his jeweler, no explanation attached, and the jeweler offered 9,600 livres for it on the spot. Louis refused the sale and kept the stone as a curiosity, and du Hausset records him turning it over in his fingers and saying that Monsieur de Saint Germain must be worth millions, especially if he also had the secret of making large diamonds out of small ones. Nobody ever found out how it was done. Substituted stone, secret lapidary skill, some trick of polishing out an inclusion. Take your pick. The Count, asked directly whether he could grow diamonds, gave the answer he always gave to direct questions, a smile and a remark that he knew a little about many things. The king, notably, stopped joking about him. More than one memoir mentions that Louis would not tolerate mockery of the Count at his table, and courtiers who tried it got a royal silence that ended the subject. Whatever the king had seen or heard in private, it had bought the stranger something almost nobody at Versailles possessed: protection. Pompadour liked him too, and teased him, and her teasing gives us the Count's own voice at its best. Du Hauset records her raising the subject everybody raised sooner or later. The old Comtesse de Gergy, widow of a former ambassador to Venice, who was going around Paris saying she had met the Count there 50 years ago. But according to her, Pompadour said, "You would be more than 100 years old." "That is not impossible," said the Count, laughing. "But it is, I allow, still more possible that the good lady, for whom I have infinite respect, is in her dotage. Watch what he did there. The whole method in one sentence. Deny nothing, confirm nothing. Hand the marvel and the mundane explanation across the table together, beautifully wrapped, and let the listener choose the one they came in wanting. Half the room went home with a joke. The other half went home with a shiver." Du Hauset preserved one more scene from those rooms, and it shows the act at close range better than anything else on record. One evening, the Count began speaking of Francis I, the great Renaissance king, dead for 2 centuries, and he did not speak like a man citing books. He described the king's face, his turn of mind, his weaknesses, and added, in a tone of soft regret, that he was a king I could have loved, and that had he been at hand he could have warned him against the disasters that ruined him. He moved on through the court of the Valois, the manners, the suppers, the women in the same intimate register, and Pompadour, watching him perform, finally said, half laughing, "You seem to have seen them all." And the Count caught himself, smiled, and stepped back through the door he had left open behind him. "I have a very good memory," he said, "and I have studied French history very deeply. I amuse myself sometimes, not in making people believe, but in letting them believe, that I lived in the oldest times. Letting them believe." His own phrase, on the record, from the one witness in the palace with no reason to invent it. He never once, in any reliable account, flatly stated an impossible age. He built the doorway, lit it beautifully, and stood aside while you walked through it yourself. The Gergy encounter became the most famous scene in his whole legend, and it runs like this. The old countess encountered him at a Paris evening, stared, and finally approached to ask whether his father had perhaps been in Venice around the year 1700. "No, madame," he replied, "but I myself was living in Venice at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one. I had the honor of paying you court then, and you were kind enough to admire a few barcarolles of my composing, which we used to sing together." "Impossible," she said. The Count de Saint Germain I knew in those days was at least 45 years old, and you, at most, are that age now. Madame, said the Count, smiling, I am very old. But then, she pressed, you must be nearly 100 years old. That, madame, is not impossible. One version of the scene carries a stranger ending. In it, the shaken old woman blurts out that he must be a devil, and the words snap something in him. The eternally composed Count trembles visibly, asks her never to use that name in his presence, and leaves the room. Make of that what you want. Showmanship has its limits, and a performer of his caliber does not usually choose trembling and flight as the button on his best routine. If it happened as told, then somewhere under the act was a man who could hear certain words and feel actual fear, and I'd give a great deal to know what he was afraid of. Gleichen, the diplomat, got the closest anyone got to a backstage confession. The Count told him, in private, these fools of Parisians believe that I am 500 years old, and I confirm them in it, since I see it gives them so much pleasure. Then, just as Gleichen was filing him comfortably under fraud, the Count added, not that I am not really infinitely older than I appear. That second sentence is the man in miniature. Even his confessions had trapdoors. Gleichen also noticed the craftsmanship in it, the way the Count adjusted the dosage of the marvelous to each listener. To the credulous he spoke of chatting with historical kings. To the skeptical he offered only vivid, hyper-detailed circumstantial history, what the weather was doing, what the man wore, what the room smelled like, delivered with such casual authority that hard-headed listeners walked away half convinced he had been standing there. Alongside the music and the chemistry, he painted, and the painting produced its own small mystery that professionals took seriously. His pictures, witnesses said, glowed. He had worked out some method of mixing crushed mother-of-pearl into his pigments so that jewels and fabrics on his canvases threw back light the way the real objects did, and established artists, including painters of real standing, asked him outright for the formula. He refused, pleasantly, the way he refused everything. The paintings themselves have since gone the way of his letters and his violin, meaning nobody can point to one today, so the glowing jewels of the Count of Saint Germain survive only as testimony, one more marvel filed under things reliable people swore they saw. And the Count let his own household do the heavy lifting. The valet stories were told all over Europe, in versions that improve with distance. At one dinner, the story goes, the Count described some incident from the reign of a medieval king in his usual eyewitness style, and a doubtful guest slid over to the Count's servant and asked whether his master was lying. The servant, perfectly grave, replied that he could not say. You see, sir, I have only been in his service 100 years. When the Count came in, he told me he was 3,000 years old. He now tells people he is 4,000. Whether he has added the 900 by accident or is lying to me, I really cannot tell you. Every ambassador in Paris repeated that one. You could not buy publicity like it, and the strong suspicion has always been that nobody had to, that the Count wrote his servant's best lines himself and rehearsed the deadpan. Then the eating. Of all his effects, this was the cheapest to produce and the most unnerving to sit through. The Count of Saint Germain was never seen to eat. He accepted every dinner invitation in Paris and touched nothing at any of them. He would sit at the most extravagant tables of the century, food arriving in waves, and talk brilliantly, continuously, through every course, while his plate stayed empty and his glass stayed full. People who claimed inside knowledge said he lived privately on oat porridge, groats, and the white meat of chicken, taken alone. Whatever the truth of his kitchen, the public effect was calculated and total. Every guest at every table got a full evening's demonstration that this man did not need what they needed. Bodies at that table were fed 6 times over and would rot on schedule. The stranger by the candles apparently ran on conversation. His audience needs a clear look too. The people crowding around him at Versailles were frightened people, seriously frightened, with every reason to be, and their fear explains his success better than any trick could. Death in mid-century France sat down at the table with you. Smallpox alone was harvesting the country continuously, and when it spared a life, it usually kept the face as payment, pitting and cratering the skin so deeply that fashionable women wore patches and thick paint for decades to hide the ruin. Childbirth killed duchesses and dairymaids at the same steady rate. A rotten tooth could kill you. A chill caught at a hunt could kill you inside a week, and the medicine available to the richest people alive was bleeding, purges, and prayer. Every person in those glittering rooms had buried children. Most had buried many, and the remedies they used against decay were quietly killing them faster. The white complexion the age demanded came from ceruse, a face paint mixed from vinegar and a poisonous metal, and it worked by slowly destroying exactly what it advertised. It corroded the skin underneath, so wearers troweled on more to cover the damage, and it seeped further in with every application, loosening teeth, swelling gums, thinning hair at the temples, dimming eyes. In London, in 1760, this cost the life of Maria Gunning, Countess of Coventry, one of the 2 Irish sisters so famously beautiful that crowds mobbed them in the parks. She refused to give up her paint even as it ate her, and she died of it at 27, spending her final weeks in a darkened room, refusing all visitors, unwilling to let anyone see what her own beauty regime had done to her face. Into that market walked the Count of Saint Germain and found a society dying of its own cosmetics, begging a stranger for the recipe of forever. To his credit, and this detail always gets lost, he never actually sold them forever. Look closely at the eyewitnesses, and his real offers were almost humble. He gave ladies washes and skin waters, and Casanova, of all people, records the honest limit of the claim. The Count admitted freely that restoring youth was beyond him, and offered only to preserve a shadow of it as it departed, a shadow of departing youth. As sales pitches for eternity go, that is practically a confession of mortality. The customers heard what they needed to hear anyway. Elderly women pressed fortunes on him for another year of their own face. He mostly declined the fortunes by the accounts and gave the bottles away, and that generosity, oddly, made everything worse, because a swindler takes the money. What do you call the man who performs the miracle for free? Speaking of Casanova, it is time to bring him on properly, because in 1757, the two most fascinating liars in Europe, finally sat down at the same dinner table, and one of them left a written review. Giacomo Casanova met the Count at the Paris house of Madame d'Urfé, an immensely rich old occultist whom Casanova himself was busy fleecing through a years-long mystical con of his own. The man holding the pen, in other words, was himself a professional, assessing a professional. And Casanova's professional assessment has become the most quoted paragraph ever written about our man. This extraordinary man, he wrote, intended by nature to be the king of impostors and quacks, would say in an easy, assured manner that he was 300 years old, that he possessed the universal medicine, that he made whatever he liked from nature, that he created diamonds and could melt 10 or 12 small ones into a single large one of the finest water without any loss of weight. All this, Casanova adds, was a mere trifle to him. Next comes the sentence that gives the whole passage away. Notwithstanding his boastings, his bare-faced lies, his manifold eccentricities, I cannot say I thought him offensive. Casanova, who despised rivals and flattered no one who couldn't pay him, could not bring himself to dislike this man. In spite of my knowledge of what he was, he admits elsewhere, and in spite of my own feelings, I thought him an astonishing man. The Count talked straight through that first dinner, from the first dish to the last, ate nothing, dazzled the table, and Casanova went home and thought about him, on the evidence of the memoirs, for the rest of his life. Casanova also, in passing, dropped the coldest and most plausible theory anyone offered about what the Count actually did for a living. He called him an agent, a spy in the pay of the French crown, wrapped in stage smoke. Within 3 years, the French crown itself would make that theory look very credible indeed. Before we get there, though, one more scene from that same Parisian year, 1757. Underneath the silk, this was the floor of their world. In January, a servant named Robert François Damiens ran at Louis XV in a Versailles courtyard and scratched him with a penknife. The wound was 1/2 inch deep. The king survived it comfortably. The response of the French state was another matter. Our Count served this king, ate at the tables of the men who ordered what follows, and lived his whole gilded French life one misstep away from the square where it happened. They brought Damiens to the Place de Grève on the 28th of March, 1757, in central Paris before an enormous paying crowd. Windows overlooking the square rented out at fantastic prices. The sentence, copied almost word for word from the century-old precedent for regicide, was executed in stages, and it took the better part of the afternoon. First, the hand that had held the knife was burned off with flaming sulphur while he was held down and made to watch. Then executioners with red-hot pincers tore chunks of flesh from his chest, his arms, and his thighs, and into each open wound they poured, from ladles, a boiling mixture of oil, melted wax, resin, and molten metal. He was alive and screaming through all of it, and witnesses wrote that between the screams he kept crying out to God. Then came the horses. 4 of them, one chained to each limb, whipped in 4 directions to pull him apart. The horses failed. They strained for over an hour, and the man's joints would not give. and eventually the executioners, exhausted, took blades and cut through the tendons at his shoulders and hips so the horses could finish the dismemberment. Accounts from the square insist he was still alive, or something close to it, as the limbs came away, his torso still moving, his jaw still working, when what remained was thrown onto the fire. His family was banished from France and ordered to change their name. His house was demolished so that the ground itself would forget him, and Casanova watched. He rented a window over the square with friends and stood there for 4 hours, and he wrote afterward that he was several times obliged to turn away his face and stop his ears as the screams came up from the scaffold, while some of his companions, he noted with disgust, never flinched at all, and worse than didn't flinch, treated the afternoon as a social occasion. The same city, the same season, the same social class. Upstairs, a smiling stranger removing the flaw from the king's diamond. Down in the square, the king's servants ladling boiling resin into a living man's wounds, while the aristocracy watched from rented windows. The Count of Saint Germain moved through that France for 15 years, with no papers and no protector beyond a bored king's affection. The running starts in 1760, and the cause of it, strangely enough, was the most honourable thing he ever tried to do. Europe by then was 3 years into the 7 Years' War, a conflict chewing through soldiers on a scale the continent had never seen. Single afternoons of it, at places like Zorndorf and Kunersdorf, left 30,000 men dead or dying in the mud, wounded men freezing overnight between the lines, farmland turned to boneyards from Bohemia to the Rhine. The Count, by several accounts, spoke of the war with open disgust, and at some point in the winter of 1759 going into 1760, he was sent himself, to the Netherlands to do something about it. The mission, as far as the diplomatic files let us reconstruct it, worked like this. He arrived at The Hague and began quietly putting out feelers toward the British, offering himself as a back channel for peace between London and Versailles. He hinted, credibly, that he acted for Louis XV personally, and behind that hint stood real patrons, the old Marshal Belle-Isle at the War Ministry, and, in most tellings, Pompadour herself. Here was the problem. France already had a foreign minister, the Duc de Choiseul, and Choiseul was committed heart and soul to the Austrian alliance and the war, and nobody had told him a jeweled stranger with no surname was in Holland negotiating peace behind his back. The British, for their part, were interested but careful. They asked the obvious question, "Can you show us credentials from the French king?" He could not. Kings do not sign paper for deniable men, deniability being the entire point of them, and the Count now discovered what deniable means when things go wrong. Choiseul found out. His reaction was volcanic. He confronted the court, forced the issue in front of Louis, and the king did what the king always did under pressure. He folded. France formally disavowed its own agent. Orders went out to the French ambassador at The Hague to demand the Count's arrest and extradition, and the word Bastille started appearing in the correspondence. The Bastille. For a man with no name, no family, no country, and now no protector, that fortress was not a prison sentence, it was a disappearance. People went into that building on unsigned royal orders and stayed for decades. Some were logged under numbers instead of names, and when they died inside, they were buried under invented names, so that even their graves lied about them. For a man whose only real possession was his mystery, the Bastille offered a horribly fitting end, a cell where the state would keep his secret for him, forever, free of charge. The scene at The Hague in those weeks would play as comedy at lower stakes. The French ambassador, the Comte d'Affry, who had been socially entertaining the Count days earlier, now presented himself to the Dutch authorities as the instrument of his destruction, formally demanding, in his king's name, the seizure of a man his king had privately encouraged. The Dutch, who understood perfectly well what they were watching, asked the reasonable question of what crime exactly the gentleman had committed on Dutch soil. The answer, stripped of diplomatic upholstery, was none. He had attempted to shorten a war. He was saved by a Dutchman's stubbornness. Count Bentinck van Roon, a senior figure at The Hague, took the view that this arrest was French factional politics being played out on Dutch soil, and he declined to be hurried. While the paperwork shuffled, Bentinck quietly arranged passage, and the British ambassador supplied a blank passport, and the Count of Saint Germain slipped across the water to England, one step ahead of the warrant, leaving behind his luggage, his standing at Versailles, and 15 years of carefully built favour. The peace he had tried to broker arrived 3 years later anyway, at terms far worse for France than anything discussed at The Hague, after several 100,000 more men had died. Nobody apologized to him, nobody ever does, in this line of work. And it is exactly here, at the lowest point of his French career, that Voltaire wrote the sentence that made him immortal in the other sense. In April of 1760, with the warrant still warm, Voltaire mentioned the affair in a letter to Frederick the Great and described the Count as a man who never dies and who knows everything. Voltaire was being acid. In context, the line drips with contempt for the whole spy circus, this ridiculous, deathless know-it-all tangled up with Choiseul and Pitt. Pull the line out of context, though, and it turns to marble. A man who never dies and who knows everything, signed Voltaire. The legend could not have commissioned a better epigraph, and the fact that it was written as an insult has never slowed it down for a second. Casanova crossed his path once more in these wilderness years, at Tournai in the Austrian Netherlands, where the Count was lying low under yet another name, running a hat factory of all things, and receiving no one. He made an exception for Casanova on the condition, Casanova notes, that he come alone, and what followed reads like two magicians visiting each other's dressing rooms. The Count, in a long beard and an alchemist's robe now, playing the sorcerer full-time, showed his guest a small, well-stoppered phial of white liquid. This, he said, was a thoeter, the universal spirit of nature, and the proof was that if the wax on the stopper were pricked, even slightly, the entire contents would vanish. Casanova, who never met a claim he wouldn't test, asked for a pin. The Count handed him the phial and the pin. Casanova pricked the wax. The phial, when he looked, was empty. He turned it over. Nothing. What became of the spirit of nature between his fingers he could not say, and being Casanova, it clearly annoyed him for years that he could not say it. Then the Count took a coin off him, an ordinary 12 sols silver piece, set it on a burning coal, worked it with a blowpipe, cooled it, and handed it back. The coin was now, to every test Casanova could apply, gold. Casanova kept it. He carried it around Europe, showing it to people, telling the story, insisting all the while that it had to be sleight of hand, that the Count must have palmed the silver and substituted a gold piece struck from the same dies. He held on to his souvenir of the fraud he could not explain until, in Berlin, he gave it away to old Marshal Keith, and nobody has seen it since, so the one physical exhibit in the whole case is missing as well. You can hear in the memoirs how much the business bothered Casanova. The trick offended him professionally. He knew it was a trick the way you know a card has been forced on you, and he never once caught the move. From the Low Countries, the trail bends east into the coldest chapter of the whole biography, the one where the wandering wonder worker turns up, of all places, on the edge of a murder. A foreign gentleman calling himself Count Soltikoff appeared in St. Petersburg in the early 1760s, and a solid line of testimony identifies him as our man. His timing, once more, was uncanny. Russia in the summer of 1762 was a loaded pistol. On the throne sat Peter III, a twitchy, Prussia-worshipping emperor who had managed in 6 months to insult the army, the church, and his own wife. And the wife happened to be the most formidable political operator of the age. Catherine moved at the start of July. The Guards regiments, marshalled by her lover Grigory Orlov and his brothers, proclaimed her empress, and Peter, offering no more resistance than a man surrendering a hand of cards, abdicated and was carted off to a country estate at Ropsha under the guard of Alexei Orlov, the biggest and most frightening of the brothers, a giant with a scar across his face from a saber fight. 8 days later, Peter was dead. The official announcement said he had died of a hemorrhoidal colic, a diagnosis so transparently absurd that it became a running joke in the courts of Europe, and for years afterward, when a Russian dignitary died suspiciously, ambassadors would murmur that the hemorrhoids had struck again. What actually happened at Ropsha comes down to us mostly through a letter Alexei Orlov scrawled to Catherine in the hours afterward, a barely coherent, terrified document. "He is no more," it says. "We ourselves know not what we did. A quarrel broke out at dinner," he writes, "a scuffle, and before anyone could separate them, he was gone. We are all guilty and deserve to die." Strangulation is the version nearly everyone believed then and most believe now, and the state of the body did nothing to argue otherwise. When Peter lay in state for the public to file past, observers noted that a large hat was pulled low over his face, and an unusually broad cravat was wound high around his throat, and that his face beneath the hat brim had gone black. The mourners shuffled past a corpse dressed to hide its own cause of death, in a church, under guard, while the new empress announced her grief. Where was our Count in all this? Somewhere in the city, under the Soltikoff name, and that is genuinely all the hard record gives us. The legend, of course, gives us much more. It puts him in the back rooms of the coup, advising, financing, some versions even whispering that he brewed something for the Orlovs' use. Nothing documentary supports any of that, and the honest position is that a coup run by Guards officers and an empress of genius did not obviously need an elderly alchemist's help. But one detail keeps the question alive, and it comes from a German witness years later. When the Count was living in the German lands in the 1770s as Graf Zeroghi, Grigory Orlov himself passed through Nuremberg, and the two men met, and the memoirist who watched it happen recorded his astonishment at the greeting. The most powerful favorite in Russia embraced the old wanderer with open affection, called him Caro Padre, "Dear Father," spent hours closeted with him, and by one account left him a fat purse of gold. Favorites like Orloff guarded their embraces and their gold carefully, and spent neither on entertainers. Whatever passed between those two, it had been earned somewhere, and Petersburg in 1762 is the only place their paths are known to have crossed. I'll leave that door exactly as ajar as the evidence leaves it. Since we are in Russia, follow the Orloffs to the end of their own roads. Ropsha never let go of either brother. Grigory, the glorious favorite, was eventually supplanted in Catherine's bed and her counsels, married a young cousin he adored, lost her to consumption within a few years, and after her death his mind gave way completely. The wreck of him was paraded through Petersburg society for months, and the witnesses to his final ravings recorded the same detail with a shudder that in his madness he screamed about Peter, that the murdered emperor would not leave him, that he saw him in the room. He died raving in 1783. Alexei, the giant who had commanded the guard at Ropsha and written the terrified letter, lived on for decades, rich, honored and untouchable, right up until Catherine died in 1796, and her son Paul took the throne. A son who had spent 34 years believing these men had strangled his father. Paul's revenge was exquisite. He had Peter III's coffin dug up after all those years, had the remains crowned, since Peter had died before his coronation, and ordered a state reburial in which the old murderers of 1762 were made to march. Alexei Orloff, past 60 now, was assigned the place of honor directly before the coffin, carrying the imperial crown on a cushion through the frozen streets, mile after mile, holding the crown of the man he had killed, while the whole capital watched him do it. Those who saw the procession said the old giant wept the entire way. Our Count, at least, was spared witnessing any of that, or, depending on your reading of this story, witnessed all of it from somewhere in the crowd, one more small treasure from those German years, before the story starts to darken for good. The name he was using, Tsarogi, looks like nothing at all until you write it out and start moving the letters, and it rearranges, perfectly, into Ragotzi. Rakoczy, the name he would finally claim on his deathbed, hidden in plain sight for years as an anagram worn like a locket under the shirt. A man keeping a secret for 90 years and still, apparently, unable to resist carrying it where he could feel it. Anagrams were a fashionable parlor game in those courts, so the disguise was, by his standards, almost reckless. A riddle set at after-dinner difficulty. When the Margrave of Ansbach's circle worked the puzzle out, the Count neither confirmed nor denied it, naturally. While he wandered, the world that had made him famous was dying off, one patron at a time. Pompadour went first. In the spring of 1764, the woman who had run the cultural life of France for 20 years was 42 years old and drowning in her own lungs. Tuberculosis, worsened by a failing heart, had been eating her for years while she worked on, coughing blood into lace handkerchiefs between audiences, painting over the grey of her face because the position of royal mistress did not permit visible dying. She fought it in the open, at Versailles itself, a privilege almost no one received, since etiquette normally required the sick to crawl away and die out of the king's sight. By April, she could no longer lie flat without suffocating, so she died sitting up in a chair, fully dressed. 15th of April, 1764. Louis was not with her at the end. Etiquette again. but he stood on a balcony in the rain 2 days later and watched her funeral carriage roll away from the palace toward Paris, tears on his face by the testimony of the man beside him. And he said the only farewell his position allowed him to say out loud. The Marquise will not have good weather for her journey. Then he went in to dinner. The Count had lost the most reliable protector he ever had, and, on the evidence of everything that came later, one of the very few people he genuinely mourned. The king's own turn came 10 years on, and almost nothing in the 18th century shows the pure animal terror underneath all that gilding, like the last 2 weeks of Louis XV. Remember, this is the man who collected death talk as a hobby, who asked healthy courtiers where they meant to be buried. In the last days of April 1774, he took ill at the Petit Trianon with fevers and aches, and was moved back to Versailles. And on the 3rd evening, the doctors, examining him by candlelight, saw the rash coming up on his face and hands, and understood at once. Smallpox. The word went through the palace like a gunshot. The king was 64, soft, worn out by decades of self-indulgence, and he had never had the disease. Confluent smallpox covers a body in thousands of pustules that run together into continuous sheets until the skin of the face effectively becomes one wound. The eyes swell shut. The throat and mouth erupt inside so that swallowing becomes agony. The sores fill, burst, and weep, and the smell of that much dying skin on a living man is something the eyewitness accounts at Versailles could not stop mentioning. A stench that filled the sick room, seeped into the state apartments, and reached, some claimed, the galleries beyond. Courtiers required by etiquette to attend the royal bedchamber stood at the far wall, breathing through handkerchiefs. Several of the attendants and guards who served that room caught the disease and died of it in the following weeks, unnamed extras carried off by the same air. The court, meanwhile, performed its rituals of abandonment with the smooth efficiency of long practice. Madame du Barry, the mistress who had shared his bed until the diagnosis, was packed into a carriage and sent away, since a king facing death needed absolution, and absolution required the sin to be off the premises first. He confessed. He received the sacraments in front of the assembled court, a public admission that the most Christian king had been living in scandal, recited out loud on his behalf while he lay behind the curtains of the bed, his face by then blackened and swollen past recognition. One witness compared it to a Moor's head, another to a mask of bronze. He lingered like that for days, conscious for much of it, in a room he had turned into an oven of infection, and in the early afternoon of the 10th of May, 1774, the candle that had been set burning in his window as a signal was snuffed out, and the whole palace heard what came next, a sound people described for the rest of their lives. A rumble like thunder, growing, rolling down the state apartments. It was the entire court, hundreds of people running, actually sprinting through the halls of Versailles, away from the dead king's rooms and toward the apartments of his 20-year-old grandson, to be first to bow to Louis XVI. The old king's body had not cooled, and his courtiers were already at a dead run toward the future. The corpse itself they could barely handle. Decomposition, racing ahead in a body ravaged like that, made embalming impossible, and no distinguished person would take the risk of touching him. So they did it crudely, The remains were soaked in spirits, packed with quicklime and aromatics, sealed in one coffin and a second over it. And even through all of that, those in attendance said, "You could smell him." The funeral was held at night, almost furtively, the procession moving fast, the escort keeping the carriages at a trot, the whole way to the crypt at Saint-Denis. And along the dark road, the Parisian crowds turned out to jeer, shouting the catcalls of the hunting field after the coffin of a king they had once called the well-beloved. "Tally-ho," they shouted, hunting cries chasing a dead king, and cruder things about the lady's pleasure going past. And into the vault he went, sealed twice against his own decay, mourned by nearly no one. Within weeks of the funeral came a postscript. The new young king, Louis XVI, submitted himself and his brothers to inoculation, the controversial procedure the old king had always refused, and inoculation in 1774 was a long way from safe vaccination. A surgeon took live matter from the sore of a smallpox sufferer and scratched it into the healthy arm of the patient, deliberately infecting the King of France with the disease that had just liquefied his grandfather, gambling that a small managed dose would beat a large wild one. For 2 weeks the court held its breath while the young king ran his fevers and raised his pustules, and the gamble came off, and Paris celebrated with commemorative hairstyles. The best minds of the age fought death by feeding it a little of yourself on a knife point and praying about the portion size. Set that beside a smiling dinner guest who implied he had settled the whole question centuries ago, and you can feel, one more time, exactly why they wanted him so badly to be real. The man in that double coffin had installed our Count at Chambord and defended him at dinner, and if you want to know why the 18th century was so hungry for a stranger who claimed the churchyard could not touch him, the answer was lying right there in the quicklime. Follow him through the middle of that decade, and the glamour starts flaking off in a way that is genuinely painful to watch. The 1770s find him drifting through the German courts, Leipzig, Dresden, the smaller principalities, older now, plainer now, offering his wares, his dyes, his tanning processes, his methods for improving cloth and colouring stones, real skills by every technical account, but pitched by a man whose credit had thinned. He would request an audience, perform a demonstration for some minister, name a price for a process, and wait. And the ministers wrote each other careful little letters about him, intrigued, wary, unwilling to commit funds to a person with no verifiable past. Some noted with surprise that the notorious Immortal now dressed simply and wore no diamonds at all. The jewels that had blinded London and Paris were gone, converted presumably one by one into travel and rent and dinners he still would not eat in public. 30 years earlier, kings had competed to fund his mysteries unasked. Now he was a salesman in his 80s with a sample case, knocking on doors, and most of the doors stayed shut. Nobody in those years called him a devil anymore. They called him difficult, or a curiosity, or old. In its way, that was the crueler verdict. The Count, by the late 1770s, was running out of continent. He was visibly old now, whatever number you attach to it, and the pattern of his life had quietly inverted. The young mystery had chased nothing and been chased by everyone. The old man wrote letters offering his dyes and his processes to courts that answered slowly or not at all. Berlin was polite and cool. Petersburg had moved on. Then, in 1779, he arrived in Altona, in the Danish-ruled duchies just outside Hamburg, and met the last name on the long list of people who mattered in his life, Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, a grandson of George II of England, brother-in-law to the King of Denmark, royal governor of Schleswig and Holstein, a soldier, a serious Freemason, and a man fascinated to the point of obsession with alchemy and the invisible world. Charles took one long look at the famous stranger, elderly, courteous, still trailing 40 years of legend, and opened his house to him. What formed between those two men over the next 5 years does not look like anything else in the Count's biography. Versailles patronage had been all glitter and audiences. This was homelier and stranger. Charles bought and refurbished an abandoned factory building in the little harbour town of Eckernförde and set the Count up in it to work on his dyes, ordering in rolls of fabric for the experiments. At Charles's summer estate of Louisenlund, a short ride away, the two of them fitted out an alchemical laboratory in a garden tower and worked in it together, side by side, prince and nameless man, colouring gemstones, compounding medicines, and producing a gold-like alloy the Count called similar. Charles's letters and memoirs use a phrase for him that no king, no duchess, no salon ever used. He called him Old Papa Saint Germain, Papa. The man who never had a family, so far as any record shows, spent his final years being called father by a prince. And the work they did, look at what it actually was. A recipe survives, the Count's own, for a medicinal tea, senna pods, elder flowers and fennel, steeped and prepared just so, and Charles had it made up and distributed free to the poor of the district, and kept a physician, Dr. Losso, on a salary of 1,200 crowns a year to dispense the Count's remedies to anyone who came. A practice Charles maintained until the doctor's own death years later. Elder flowers and fennel for fishermen's families. That is what the terrifying immortal of the Paris salons, the man who never dies and knows everything, was doing with his final strength. Charles summed him up afterward in a passage that has to be quoted, because it is the only full-length portrait we have from someone who loved him. He was perhaps one of the greatest philosophers who ever lived, a friend of humanity, wanting money only to give it to the poor, a friend even to animals. His heart was concerned only with the happiness of others. He believed he could make mankind happy by providing them with new pleasures, finer cloths and colours, and his beautiful dyes cost almost nothing to produce. I have never known a man with a clearer mind and an erudition above all in history that astonished me. Louisenlund itself made a genuinely strange setting for a last act. Charles had laid out the grounds as a landscape of initiation, walks and monuments threaded with Masonic emblems, hermitages, symbolic gates, a garden you were meant to walk as a spiritual exercise, and the tower where the two men worked stood inside that landscape like the innermost chamber of the whole design. Charles belonged to the most mystical currents of German Freemasonry, circles that took Rosicrucian legends and secret superiors entirely seriously. And in those circles the Count's arrival on his doorstep was received roughly the way a devout parish would receive a wandering apostle. Visitors came. Fellow initiates wrote asking about the famous adept, and Charles fielded the letters with the protectiveness of a son, telling correspondents about the dear old man's health, his work, his moods through the northern winters. And the household did its own quiet guessing about the central question, with numbers running from a merely remarkable late 80s up past the full century, and the old man serving under all these speculations poured his energy, by every record, into fabric dyes and cheap medicines. If he ever handed Charles the philosopher's stone, neither the prince's accounts nor his account books show a trace of it. What the account books show is fennel tea. You can hear the grief in it. And worse was coming fast, because the Baltic climate was doing what the Bastille, the Tower of London, and 40 years of enemies had failed to do. The Count had always hated the cold. Witnesses across his whole life mention it, the fires kept high, the heavy furs, the way he wilted in northern winters, and now he was living, in his 80s or his 90s or his 100s, in a dye works on the Baltic shore, where the wind comes off the water with salt in it, and the winters clamp down for months. His first quarters in Eckernförde, before better rooms were arranged, were in a damp basement, and Charles wrote afterward, with an edge of guilt you can still feel, that he blamed those wet walls for the rheumatism that took hold of his friend and never let go. The elegant body that had danced at Versailles seized up, joint by joint. He grew depressed, and the German sources use exactly that register, heavy in spirit, melancholic, an old man sitting close to the stove with his hands aching, in a fishing town, at the end of a road that had started maybe in a Medici bedroom. He knew what was coming. Before Charles left for Kassel late in 1783, called away on family business over the winter, the two had a conversation the prince recorded, and it is the most frustrating paragraph in this entire subject. The Count told him that if he should die during the prince's absence, he would leave behind a sealed letter for him, and he said, "And I dare not tell you more before I die. Dare not, cannot, will not, dare not in his 90s, with nothing left to lose, in the safest harbour he had ever found, from the one man on earth he trusted. Whatever the secret was, the fear of it had outlived power and exile alike, and now, apparently, it was going to outlive him." Charles rode south. The winter closed in, and through January and February of 1784, in the rooms over the dye works, the Count of Saint Germain went down slowly under what the accounts describe as a rheumatic illness settling into his chest, most likely in modern terms, pneumonia grinding down an ancient body. Line up who was in the room and who was not. He had no family in the ordinary sense, and no name under which anyone could have been notified. The prince, his one friend, was hundreds of miles away and would not learn the news for days. By the local tradition, the people who actually nursed him through those last weeks were hired women of the town, fisherwives and servants, sitting with a courteous, failing old foreigner whose story they could not have begun to guess, feeding the stove, changing the linens, listening to his breathing get worse. On the 27th of February, 1784, it stopped. The man who never dies died of a bad chest, in winter, in a factory, with strangers. And the paperwork of it, the paperwork we started this whole video with, closed over him like water. The so-called Count of Saint Germain and Weldon wrote the pastor of Saint Nikolai, deceased on the 27th, buried on the 2nd of March, tomb number 1, inside the church. 10 thalers for 30 years of ground, 2 for the digger, 12 marks for the bell. The estate could not pay it, so the town waived it, out of respect for the prince. And a month later, on the 3rd of April, the mayor and council of Eckernförde published a formal proclamation, the standard legal notice for an intestate stranger, inviting any relative of the deceased to come forward and claim his effects, failing which they would be auctioned. Take that notice for what it was. A little Baltic town addressing the entire world in legal boilerplate, asking, "Does anyone belong to this man?" And the answer from the entire world was silence. Nobody came forward from anywhere on earth. The effects went under the hammer, the shirts and razors and toothbrushes of a legend, sold off to whoever wanted a dead stranger's combs. 2 absences stand out in that inventory. The papers first. This was a man who wrote constantly, who corresponded with courts, who claimed processes and formulas worth fortunes, and the inventory shows a packet of paid bills and receipts, and after that, nothing written at all. His journals, his correspondence, the formulas he had offered to half the courts of Germany, none of it was in the room. Either he destroyed everything himself, methodically, as the end approached, one last act of the concealment he had practiced since childhood, or someone went through those rooms before the town clerk did. Charles, when he returned, searched for the sealed letter his friend had promised him. He never found it. Whatever the Count dared not say alive, he had, in the end, not dared to say dead either, unless the letter existed and someone else got there first. And around that possibility, a small forest of speculation has grown, and I'll let you wander it on your own time. Then the violin. 40 years of testimony about the instrument, the playing that sounded like an orchestra, Walpole's line about a musician too great not to be famous, and in the death inventory of everything the man owned, no violin appears. Somewhere between the salons and the grave, he lost, sold, or gave away his music. Before the end, even the sound was gone. Charles never really got over it. His memoirs, written decades later, still circle back to the loss. And there is one more line of his I want you to hear, past the philosopher eulogy. He wrote that the Count was perhaps deceived by his own hopes of long life, that the dear old man had spoken of reaching a great age yet, and that his death was, for Charles, a bereavement he felt with his whole heart. A reigning prince of the House of Hesse, a general, a governor of duchies, mourning a nameless die-maker like a father. Whatever else the Count of Saint Germain faked in his long run across the century, he did not fake that friendship. It is, in a life built entirely of performances, the one relationship with no audience, and it ended with the survivor searching an empty room for a letter that was never there. Now you would think the grave would be the end of the story, and with this man, of course, it is barely the middle. But before the sightings and the seances and everything the next 2 centuries did to him, follow the physical thread a little further. into what happened to his actual resting place. The Church of St. Nikolai stands close to the harbour near the water, and on the 13th of November 1872, the water came for it. A freak combination of gales pushed the Baltic into the worst storm surge the region has ever recorded, and Eckernförde took the hardest hit of any town on the German coast. The sea rose more than 3 meters above its normal level and came through the streets. Along the wider Baltic coastline that night, the surge killed around 270 people and left many thousands homeless in the November cold, whole villages of fishermen losing houses, boats and livelihoods between midnight and morning, and Eckernförde stood at the center of the destruction. 78 houses were destroyed outright, well over 100 more damaged, over 100 families left with nothing in a November night. People drowned in their own parlours along that coast, and the flood poured into the church itself, into the nave, over the floor under which the dead of the parish lay in their numbered tombs. When the water finally went back out, the parish faced a ruined, sodden burial floor, and they made the practical decision parishes make. The tombs inside the church were filled in with sand. The heavy grave slabs were taken up and removed. The floor was made good. And in that renovation, the location of tomb number 1, along with its occupant, was lost. Nothing dramatic happened to it, no desecration, no robbery. It was simply misplaced, under sand, in a repair job, and services resumed within the season. The congregation at prayer above fresh-packed ground, with nobody able to say any more exactly where the famous stranger lay beneath them. So today you can stand in that church, and he is there, somewhere below the floor, and no one can tell you where. The sea rose up 88 years after his burial and erased the last fixed point of him, the one set of coordinates the man had finally, in death, been forced to accept. Even his 30-year lease on that ground had long expired by then, with no one left to renew it. A person could get superstitious about a life like this. No record of entering the world, and now, functionally, no record of where he left it. The pastor's phrase covers the grave as well as the man, further information not known, and into that perfect vacuum, almost immediately, the sightings began. The first posthumous appearance on the books comes barely a year after the funeral. Masonic tradition places the Count of Saint Germain at a great convention of lodges in 1785, seated among the delegates as if February in Eckernförde had simply not applied to him. He had moved in Masonic and Rosicrucian circles for decades, so the setting, at least, was plausible, and the claim spread wide and stuck hard. Against it stands a piece of dull, immovable paper. The minutes of that convention survive, with the participants listed, and his name is not among them. A legend on one side, an attendance sheet on the other. I'll let you sit wherever you like between those two documents, and I'd only point out that this exact shape, a glorious story leaning against a boring record, is going to repeat from here to the end of the video. The richest vein of sightings, though, comes from a single book, and the book has a strange history of its own. In the 1830s, memoirs were published under the name of the Comtesse d'Adhémar, presented as the recollections of a lady-in-waiting to Marie Antoinette. and they are saturated with the Count. In their pages, he returns to Versailles in the 1780s to warn the doomed young court. He requests secret audiences. He sends the Queen letters and prophetic verses foretelling, in her reported words, the overthrow of everything that exists. He tells the Countess that a conspiracy far larger than anyone at court suspected is closing over France, that the royal family will be given no mercy, and, in the book's most quoted exchange, when she begs him to intervene, he answers that he cannot, that his hands are tied by one stronger than himself, and that the hour has passed when he could have saved them. The memoirs then track him past his own death without blinking. The Countess reports seeing him unchanged at the fall of the monarchy in 1792, at the Queen's execution in 1793, on the eve of a murder of a royal prince in 1804, in 1813, and once more in 1820. And she notes, in a marginal comment supposedly written near the end of her life, always the same face, always the same age. The Queen's own reported words in that book go like this. "Who is this personage?" she asks, "who has watched over me for so many years without ever making himself known, without asking anything of me, and who has always told me the truth? He now warns me of the ruin of everything, and if he offers any hope, it is so far away that I may not reach it." She did not reach it. And here the memoirs, whatever they are, hand off to the plain historical record, and the record is worse than anything in them. The world the Count had lived in for 15 years, the salons and supper tables full of people who had teased him about being 100 years old, went under the blade inside 18 months, and 2 deaths from his old circle belong here. The Princesse de Lamballe first. She had been the Queen's dearest friend, superintendent of her household, a gentle, rather fragile woman from exactly the world of court ladies the Count had spent his French years charming. In September of 1792, with the prisons of Paris crammed with aristocrats and the mob inflamed by invasion panic, the massacres began, days of systematic butchery in the prison yards. Lamballe was held at La Force. Brought out before a so-called popular tribunal in the yard, she was ordered to swear hatred of the king and queen. She refused. She was pushed out a door into an alley full of men with pikes, sabres and clubs, and they killed her there on the cobbles, and the killing was only the start of it. Her head was cut off and fixed on a pike, and the crowd carried it across Paris to the Temple prison, where the royal family was held, and paraded it beneath the windows. Some in the mob shouting up for the Queen to come and kiss her friend. By several accounts they had stopped at a hairdresser's on the way and had the dead woman's hair washed and curled so that the Queen would recognize her at once. Marie Antoinette was spared the sight only because she fainted. The little supper parties ended there, on the cobbles outside La Force, and the warnings in the memoirs, real or invented, were warnings about exactly this. The Queen herself followed 13 months later, and her last day is documented down to the minute. By October of 1793, she had spent 10 weeks in a cell in the conciergerie, watched day and night, her health collapsing, hemorrhaging so badly in her final weeks that she was visibly wasting, her hair gone white in her 38th year. After a 2-day show trial that included accusations so vile even the revolutionary courtroom went quiet, she was sentenced at 4 in the morning of the 16th of October, 1793. They took her back to the cell, cut her hair off at the neck for the blade, tied her hands behind her, and while her husband had at least been driven to his death in a closed carriage, she was placed backwards in an open cart and hauled for an hour through streets packed with jeering crowds, made to sit upright and be looked at the whole way. Witnesses describe her face as empty, spent, past reacting. At the scaffold in what is now the Place de la Concorde, climbing the steps, she trod on the executioner's foot, and her last recorded words were an apology to him. "Monsieur, I beg your pardon. I did not do it on purpose." The man whose foot she stepped on was Henri Sanson, of the great hereditary dynasty of French executioners, and one family thread runs under this whole story. His father, Charles-Henri Sanson, who had dropped the blade on the Queen's husband 9 months earlier, had begun his working life as a young assistant on the Place de Grève in 1757, helping with the pincers and the horses at the destruction of Damiens. One family's career, spanning from the afternoon Casanova covered his ears at the window to the morning the Queen apologized on the scaffold, the whole arc of the Count's France, measured out in the working diary of its executioners. Moments later, the blade came down, the executioner lifted the head to show the crowd, and the square roared. She was buried in a common grave with the lime, her legs folded because the coffin supply had run short. 2 months after the Queen, the terror reached back into our Count's own chapter of Versailles and collected Madame du Barry, the mistress who had been hustled away from Louis XV's deathbed 20 years before. Nearly every aristocrat who climbed those scaffold steps performed composure at the end, dignity being the last property the revolution could not confiscate, and du Barry is remembered precisely because she refused the performance. She fought. On the 8th of December, 1793, she had to be dragged to the cart and dragged from it, weeping and screaming the whole way, calling out to the crowd for rescue, promising treasures to anyone who would save her. And on the platform itself she struggled with the executioners and begged, and her last recorded words were a plea to the headsman. "One more moment, Monsieur Executioner, one little moment." He did not give it to her. Spectators wrote afterward that her screaming unsettled the square as no stoic death ever had, that the crowd, accustomed to applauding, went quiet, because a person fighting for one more moment of existence with her whole animal strength made the machinery feel, suddenly, like what it was. She had shared a supper table, in the old days, with a man who priced immortality in smiles and washes. She went to the blade, begging for 60 seconds. The Diplomat memoirs claim the Count was seen in the crowd that day, unchanged, watching. And now I owe you the other half of the story of those memoirs. When scholars went digging into the book's history, the trail ran back to a man named Baron de la Mothe Langon, a spectacularly industrious writer of the early 1800s, who produced, over his career, entire shelves of memoirs attributed to dead people he had never met, court ladies, police ministers, mistresses of kings, all in the same suspiciously fluent voice. His inventions had range too. Separate from all this, he wrote accounts of medieval witch trials, complete with mass burnings in southern France, that historians repeated as fact for over a century before anyone checked the archives and found the trials were not in them. The Saint Germain warnings most likely came from that same pen. Even Isabel Cooper Oakley, the theosophist who compiled the great sympathetic biography of the Count in 1912 and who wanted to believe every word, conceded that the Diplomat book was a compilation rather than an authentic memoir, so each of you gets to weigh it. On one side, the most haunting scenes in the entire legend, the deathless friend warning the doomed queen. On the other, the documented career of the man who probably wrote them 40 years after the fact, for money. Both of those things are on the table. I've told you what is on it. One more figure from those revolutionary scenes, and the memoirs bind him to our Count directly. In their pages, the Count names the sorcerer Cagliostro as the agent of the catastrophe, the great magician whose hands were on events. Cagliostro was the Count's obvious successor and dark mirror, another travelling wonder-worker of no fixed origin, elixirs, seances, Egyptian lodges, a superstar of the 1780s who reportedly claimed the Count himself had initiated him into the mysteries at a ceremony in Holstein. Set their endings side by side, and something almost moral emerges. The Count died free, in obscurity, mourned by a prince, and vanished into sand. Cagliostro was arrested by the Roman Inquisition, condemned for heresy, and buried alive in the fortress of San Leo, in a stone pit of a cell they called the Well, entered through a trapdoor in the ceiling, where he spent 4 years going to pieces in the dark, raving, refusing confession, until a stroke finished him in 1795. The jailers buried him without rites on a hillside, and revolutionary soldiers who took the fortress a couple of years later reportedly dug him up to see the famous charlatan for themselves, and made a drinking cup of his skull. Of the two immortals, the one who promised less got the king to exit. Eckernförde, in hindsight, was mercy. And since we are settling accounts, spare a minute for the third adventurer of those Paris dinner tables. Casanova outlived them all. The great lover of the age finished as a librarian in a drafty bohemian castle at Dux, employed half out of charity, old and gout-ridden, mocked behind his back by the household servants, who hid his books and salted his soup for sport. He spent those last years doing the exact opposite of everything the Count had done. He wrote it all down, thousands of pages, every name and every year, each humiliation of age recorded against himself with brutal honesty. A man pinning his entire past to paper, as if documentation could hold him together. He died in 1798, and by the account that came down from the room, his last words were that he had lived as a philosopher and was dying as a Christian. His grave at Dux was lost too, oddly enough, the marker gone within a couple of generations, the century's most documented man and its least documented man, and the ground swallowed both markers just the same. The 19th century kept producing him the way a coastline keeps producing driftwood. The most charming specimen comes from the memoirs of an English journalist named Albert Van Dam, who described a man he had known personally in the Paris of the 1840s, a certain Major Fraser. The Major lived alone, kept no visible occupation, and spent freely from funds nobody could trace. His conversation was the thing. He appeared to possess an eyewitness command of every European country in every period, tossing off details about the private habits of long-dead men the way you or I would gossip about neighbors. And when pressed on how he could know such things, he would deflect with what Van Dam called a strange smile, letting slip on various evenings that he had known Nero and had spoken with Dante. The company laughed, of course, and Van Dam records that the laughter never seemed to reach the Major, and that his own private impression of the man was uncomfortably serious. Then one day, Major Fraser was simply gone. No death, no departure, no forwarding address, no trace, and Van Dam, writing years later, admitted the suspicion he could never quite put down, that he had been sharing cigars with the Count of Saint Germain. Van Dam put the story into print decades later, in a memoir otherwise full of editors and politicians, knowing exactly how it would sound beside them, and let it stand anyway. A heavier story from the same century concerns the Emperor of the French himself. Napoleon III, the tale runs, became fascinated enough by the Count to order a commission to gather every document about him in the state archives, the police files, the diplomatic traffic, the whole paper ghost of the man, into one collection at the Tuileries Palace. In 1871, during the bloody suppression of the Paris Commune, the Tuileries was set on fire and burned for 2 days, and the dossier, the story concludes, burned with it, every official trace of the Count in French hands gone up in one blaze. Now, I can't take you into an archive and show you the shelf where that dossier used to sit, and the tale circulates mostly in books already friendly to the legend, so grade it accordingly. But notice the story that keeps happening around this man, the church records lost, the grave misplaced under sand, the papers missing from the death inventory, and now the state dossier consumed by fire. At some point, the pattern itself becomes the biography. History lost this man's paperwork with suspicious enthusiasm. Toward the end of that century, the Count stopped being a ghost story and got a promotion, and the promotion changed everything about how the next 100 years would treat him. Helena Blavatsky, the Russian occultist who founded the Theosophical Society, built her teaching around a hidden brotherhood of perfected human beings, masters of wisdom, guiding humanity from behind the veil, and she installed the Count among them, calling him in print the greatest Oriental adept that Europe had seen in centuries. Her successor, Annie Besant, went further and stated plainly that she had met him in the flesh in 1896, 112 years after Eckernförde. After Besant came Charles Leadbeater, the movement's great clairvoyant, who described walking and conversing with the master in Rome in the 1920s, and whose description belongs beside everything else in this video. Leadbeater's Count wears, on ceremonial occasions, a suit of golden chainmail that once belonged to a Roman emperor, over it a magnificent robe of violet, and he radiates such splendor that men bow without knowing why. Hold that image in one hand, in the other, hold the rheumatic old man by the stove in the dye works, whose entire wardrobe fit in one inventory paragraph, and who was nursed to death by fisherwives. Same person, according to the doctrine. I'll leave the two of them standing there together. From theosophy, the Count passed into the broader teachings that grew out of it, and by the 20th century he had become something no 18th century salon would recognize, an ascended master, a being who had graduated from the human condition entirely. In this cosmology, he is the Lord of the seventh ray, the hierarch of the coming age of Aquarius, associated forever with the color violet and with a purifying violet flame, and his backstory swelled to match the rank. Successive revelations identified his previous incarnations as, among others, the prophet Samuel, Saint Joseph, Merlin, Christopher Columbus, and Sir Francis Bacon, with the Bacon chapter carrying a flourish even this story hadn't seen before. The claim that Bacon faked his own death in 1626 and attended his own funeral in disguise before traveling east to achieve immortality. The one thing the historical Count guarded above life itself, the emptiness where a name should be, has been stuffed to bursting. He who refused to claim one identity in 90 years has been handed a dozen, retroactively, by people born long after anyone who ever heard his voice was dust. It is hard not to feel that somewhere in this process the actual person, the frightened and generous old musician, got buried a second time, and this burial has no register entry at all. From those circles the legend crossed to America, and in America it finally started costing ordinary people everything they had. Guy Ballard, a mining engineer and longtime student of occult literature, was hiking in August of 1930 on the slopes of Mount Shasta in Northern California, a volcano already thick with mystical folklore, when, by his own account, he met a young-looking man on the trail who offered him a cup filled with a creamy liquid, a draught, the stranger said, from the universal supply. The stranger identified himself as the ascended master Saint Germain. Out of that encounter, Ballard built the I Am activity, a religious movement with the Count at the absolute center of its revelation, and it exploded across Depression-era America. Within 8 years, it claimed as many as 1 million followers. Ballard and his wife Edna toured the country holding vast staged classes, transmitting messages from Saint-Germain to packed auditoriums, and the movement's publishing arm, named the Saint-Germain Press, poured out books, records, and portraits of the master, a glowing violet-cloaked figure that would have startled the man in the dye works considerably. The machinery underneath eventually drew the attention of federal prosecutors. Followers were taught that supply, health, and ascension flowed to the faithful, and while donations were called love gifts and never formally demanded, the blessings of the masters were understood to attach to the giving. Money moved in one direction, in Depression America, from people who often had almost nothing toward the Ballards in impressive volume, and the movement asked for far more than money. Serious students renounced tobacco, alcohol, meat, and card playing, and married couples were taught to give up physical relations entirely, since the energies were needed for higher work. Practice centered on decrees, affirmations chanted aloud, in unison, at volume, for hours at a stretch, calling down light, supply, and protection, and some decrees ran the other direction, calling for the annihilation of the movement's enemies, blasted in the terminology by the very violet flame the gentle Count of Eckernförde had posthumously been assigned. Families split over it. Adult children watched parents sign over savings, cut off doubting relatives, and wait obediently for ascension. And the movement's crowning promise was the Count's own old specialty with the safety removed. Ballard taught that the faithful might ascend bodily without dying at all. Death itself was optional for the truly aligned. Elderly followers reordered their entire lives around that teaching. Some, by later testimony, declined medical care. Why would you cut your body when the body was about to be raised in light? Guy Ballard died in December of 1939 of arteriosclerosis, in the ordinary human way, in the night. For a movement whose founder had preached physical ascension, this presented a problem of some delicacy, and Edna Ballard solved it the only way available. She announced that her husband had, in fact, ascended, and simply left the body behind as the masters sometimes did. Many believed her. Enough did not that the movement began to bleed members, and worse was coming, because in 1942 the federal government indicted Edna and her son Donald for mail fraud, charging that they had collected over $3 million from followers on the strength of religious representations, the Shasta meeting, the messages, the healing claims, that the Ballards themselves, the indictment said, knew to be false. They were convicted, and the appeal of that conviction climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and turned into a landmark because the case forced the highest court in the land to answer a question the Count of Saint Germain had been posing at dinner tables since 1750. Can a court of law decide whether a miracle claim is true? In United States versus Ballard, 1944, the court answered no. Juries, wrote Justice Douglas, may weigh whether a religious claimant sincerely believes what they preach, but the truth of the belief itself, the reality of the masters, the meeting on the mountain, is beyond the competence of any court. Because putting faith itself on trial would put every faith on trial. Justice Jackson, dissenting, wanted the prosecution abandoned altogether and wrote a sentence lawyers still quote, "I would dismiss the indictment and have done with this business of judicially examining other people's faiths." The conviction was later thrown out on separate grounds in a second trip to the Supreme Court, because women had been systematically excluded from the jury pool that convicted a movement whose members were overwhelmingly women. The I Am activity survives, much reduced, to this day, still centered on the Master Saint Germain, still headquartered where the Ballards left it. So the nameless man from Eckernförde, dead a century and a half, generated a pillar of American religious liberty law without lifting a finger. His entire life, no court, no church, no salon had ever managed to rule on what he was. In 1944, the United States Supreme Court made it official. Nobody gets to rule on it. The question itself is protected. And so this story arrives, at last, at a television studio in Paris, 1972, and at the strangest, saddest chapter in the whole 200-year afterlife of the Count of Saint Germain. Because in that year, on French national television, a man stood up and announced that he was the Count, in person, still alive, and France, for a little while, absolutely loved him for it. His name was Richard Chanfray. Born in Lyon around 1940, he had knocked around the edges of French life for 3 decades before his moment came, and the knocking around included prison. He had served time for theft, and during one robbery he had assaulted a woman, a detail his later glamour never quite washed out, and by his own telling, it was in a prison library that he first encountered the story of the deathless Count and recognized, as he put it, himself. He came out with a new posture, a new wardrobe, a new past. Velvet coats, lace at the wrists, an aristocratic drawl, and a biography that ran back through Versailles to the pharaohs. The original Count had let other people whisper the immortality claims while he smiled. Chanfray simply said it, out loud, to anyone. "I am the Count of Saint Germain. I have lived for centuries. I remember." The timing of his arrival was as sharp as anything the original ever managed. French television in the early 70s was in the grip of a full paranormal fever. Spoonbenders, telepaths, healers, flying saucer contactees, all rotating through the studios to enormous ratings, and the networks had taken to keeping a professional magician on hand as a sort of house immune system, the man whose job was to watch the miracle from 3 feet away. That was Gérard Majax. Into this ecosystem walked a handsome ex-convict from Lyon, claiming to be a courtier of Louis XV in the original flesh, and the ecosystem embraced him on contact. The television appearance made him a star overnight. In front of the cameras, with the illusionist Gérard Majax standing by as a professional observer, Chanfray produced a camping stove, an ordinary household camping stove, set a lump of base grey metal over the flame, worked at it, and presented the result to the studio. "Gold," he said. "Transmutation. Live. Between the commercials." The original Count had needed Chambord, a royal laboratory, and a month's mystery to upgrade one diamond. His 20th century echo did the philosopher's stone on a camp stove in a studio in about the time it takes to soft boil an egg. Majax, whose entire career was the exposure of tricks, watched from close range, and he has spoken about that evening many times in the years since. France did not especially care how the trick worked either way. 1970s France, drenched in post-68 mysticism, gurus on every channel, was hungry for exactly this, and Chanfray became a fixture, a talk show immortal, a beautiful oddity in velvet. He recorded a single, he posed for magazines, and he caught the eye of one of the most famous women in the country, Dalida. If you grew up outside the French-speaking and Mediterranean worlds, it is hard to convey how enormous she was. A singer on the scale of national monuments, born in Cairo to Italian parents, crowned Miss Egypt, conqueror of French music for 2 decades, tens of millions of records, a voice everyone's mother owned. And by the time Chanfray entered her life in 1972, that glittering career had a trench of graves running beside it. In January of 1967, she had gone to the San Remo Song Festival to perform a duet with her lover, the Italian singer-songwriter Luigi Tenco. Their song was eliminated from the competition. Tenco took it catastrophically to heart, and that night, in the hotel, he died by his own hand, leaving a note bitter about the jury, and it was Dalida who found him in the room. A month later, in a Paris hotel, She attempted to follow him and survived only because she was found in time, lying 5 days in a coma while the country held its breath. 3 years after that, in 1970, her ex-husband Lucien Maurice, the radio executive who had built her career and whose heart she had broken, shot himself in the apartment where they had once lived together. 2 of the men closest to her, gone the same way, inside 4 years, and her own near miss in between. She was the woman who, in 1972, fell in love with a man whose entire public identity was a promise that death could be refused. You can see the pull of it. Whatever Chanfray was to the television audience, to her he was warmth and theatre, a man who treated existence itself as negotiable, and they stayed together for 9 years. The relationship, behind the velvet, ran hot and frightening. Chanfray was jealous and volatile, more erratic every year as his fame cooled, and the Count of the camping stove kept a shotgun in the bedroom. In one incident that ended in front of a court, he fired on a man in his own kitchen, the lover of a household servant, wounding him, an immortal sage of the ages, doing time and paying damages over a shooting at home. The fame itself had a short half-life. Novelty acts always do, and by the late 70s the invitations were thinning, the singles had stopped charting, and the immortal of the talk shows was drifting toward the Riviera, dealing in antiques around Saint-Tropez. Still in the velvet, still telling the centuries-old stories to smaller and smaller rooms. People who encountered him in those years describe a man who seemed unable to take the costume off, who had merged with the character so completely that no Richard remained underneath to retreat to. The original Count had run the same act for 40 years, but the original had skills to fall back on when a court cooled: chemistry, music, languages, diplomacy. The copy had only the claim. Dalida left him in 1981. His celebrity was gone by then, the talk shows had moved on, the money had run out. And being the Count of Saint Germain, it turned out, was a job with no pension. The original had ended in a die works with 14 shirts. His echo ended on the Riviera, and 2 real people died in the ending. Bastille Day, the 14th of July, 1983. In the pine country near Saint-Tropez, Richard Chanfray and his girlfriend, a young woman named Paula Deleuze, were found dead in his car. They had taken barbiturates, and the exhaust had been run into the cabin. He left a note, and the note is the last thing the man who called himself the Deathless Count ever said. "I leave," he wrote, "and I bring her with me, because she is so like me." He was in his early 40s. The Immortality had lasted 11 years, and the trench of graves beside Dalida had claimed 1 more. She worked on through the 80s, still filling halls, still adored, and privately going darker year by year, speaking to friends about exhaustion and about the loneliness underneath a life spent entirely on stage. Her own end came on the 3rd of May, 1987, in her house in Montmartre, where she took an overdose of barbiturates deliberately and did not survive it. Her note was found beside her, 1 line, addressed to everyone. "Life has become unbearable to me. Forgive me." She was 54. Paris gave her the funeral of a head of state. Thousands lined the streets of Montmartre, her neighborhood, the climb of little stairways and vines where she had lived for 25 years. And today the city keeps her everywhere there. Her tomb in the Montmartre cemetery carries a full-length statue of her in stage dress, lit like a performance, one of the most visited graves in France, and a small square nearby was renamed Place de l'Ida, with a bronze bust whose chest has been polished bright by decades of tourists' hands, flowers and photographs and candles all year round. The woman who loved a counterfeit immortal ended up with the closest thing modern Paris grants to actual immortality, a permanent audience. Her despair was her own, built from losses that long predated Chanfray, and no single person owns the blame for it. But it is a matter of plain record that the last great love of her life was a man whose whole identity was the claim that death had no power over him, and that he died by his own choice, and that 4 years later, so did she. The legend of the man who cannot die by the 1980s had wrapped itself around this much documented, certified 20th century death. Tenco, Maurice, Chanfray, Deleuze, Dalida. 5 stones, and the old story threading between them like smoke. If the Count could have seen what his name became, the auditoriums in Los Angeles, the camping stove, the velvet, the graves in Montmartre, I genuinely wonder which part would have appalled him most. The man himself, remember, dialed his own miracle down when pressed, not restoring youth, merely preserving a shadow of it as it departs. His imitators removed every one of his careful hedges, and other people paid for the removal. He sold a shadow and knew it was a shadow. The 20th century sold the sun. One last document belongs in the file before we go back to the Baltic, and it is the one the believers treasure most. A collection of Viennese recollections, published in the mid-1800s by a man named Franz Graffer, describes the Count visiting Vienna in the 1780s and taking his leave with a prophecy. Toward the end of this century, he says in Graffer's account, "I shall disappear out of Europe and betake myself to the region of the Himalayas. I will rest. I must rest. Exactly in 85 years will people again set eyes on me. Farewell." The recollections surfaced decades after the fact from a writer with a shaky reputation, and you now know this story well enough to apply the usual weights and measures yourself. But the believers did their own counting long ago, and they will tell you, with some satisfaction, that the Theosophical Society, the organization that raised the Count from historical curiosity to immortal master, was founded in New York in 1875. 85 years, more or less, from the farewell in Vienna. A coincidence of round numbers and loose dating, or an appointment, kept punctually, by a man who was never late for anything. The evidence, as always with him, arranges itself into whichever shape you brought with you. The teachings themselves did survive the ballads, and they kept mutating. Out of the I Am lineage came new movements through the middle of the century, and the largest of them, the church built by Mark and Elizabeth Clare Prophet, carried the Master Saint Germain to a strange late crescendo. By the 1980s, that church had gathered thousands of members onto a ranch in Montana, guided by dictations from the masters delivered through Mrs. Prophet. And when the dictations turned to prophecies of nuclear war, the community started digging. Vast underground shelters went into the Montana hillsides, stocked for years of survival. And in March of 1990, on the appointed night, families sold homes and left careers behind to file underground and wait for the missiles. Morning came, ordinary and empty. The missiles stayed wherever missiles stay. The members climbed back out into an unexploded world, and the church never recovered its numbers. Mrs. Prophet herself declined slowly afterward and died in 2009, her mind taken years earlier by illness. Mount Shasta, meanwhile, still draws pilgrims who hike Ballard's slopes hoping for their own cup of creamy liquid, and channeled volumes of the Count's current teachings continue to appear, dictated, their authors say, from wherever ascended masters dictate. All these years on, the machinery he built with a smile and an unanswered question runs on without him, self-powering, needing no operator at all. Against all of that noise, the actual physical remains of the man make a very short list. The music survives. You can buy modern editions of his violin sonatas and his English songs, and ensembles occasionally record them, so it is possible tonight in your kitchen to hear the same melodic lines that Walpole heard in a London drawing room while the Jacobite heads were drying on Temple Bar. A favourite song of his sets the words, "Oh, wouldst thou know what sacred charms?" And people who play through the collection describe the voice in it as graceful, melancholy, and slightly old-fashioned even for its own time, a composer looking backward, writing gentle music in a gentle style while claiming at dinner to remember the courts that invented it. Even his sheet music, in other words, keeps a straight face and refuses to answer the question. The laboratory tower at Louis and Lund still stands, on the grounds of what is now an elite boarding school. So German teenagers walk daily past the Garden Folly, where a prince and a nameless old man once tried to colour gemstones and cheat the periodic table. Eckernförde is a cheerful little resort town now, all beaches and holiday families, and the Church of St. Nikolai still stands where it stood, a few streets from the water that once came for it. The register with the pastor's careful entry survives, and researchers still travel to consult it, turning to the page for 1784 and finding the ink as legible as the day the clerk gave up on the facts. The estate inventory survives too. A handful of his letters survive in various archives, business letters mostly, dies and money and travel, his entire earthly footprint in full. Some sheet music, a tower, 2 pages of bureaucracy, and a floor nobody can see under. Watch how the respectable reference books handle him, and you can see the whole problem compressed into typography. Open a serious encyclopedia entry on the Count of Saint Germain today, and the birth line offers you a choice, 1691 or 1712, question marks optional, 2 candidate years separated by more than 2 decades, because the sources genuinely cannot close the gap. Take the earlier year and the deathbed Rakozzi story becomes chronologically awkward. Take the later year and the testimony of Rameau and the Old Lady of Venice becomes flatly impossible. a 50-year-old face remembered from a year before its owner was born. The one certain date in his whole existence, the 27th of February 1784, sits at the end of the entry like the single nail holding up an entire wall of maybes. Serious academic journals have carried articles on his music. His diplomacy has a footnote presence in histories of the 7 Years' War, and his chemistry earns him respectful mentions in accounts of 18th century die-making, so pieces of him keep passing peer review while the whole man keeps slipping through. Older reference works solved the discomfort by dismissal, filing him briskly under adventurers and charlatans and moving on. The newer treatments have grown more careful, crediting the chemistry, the music, and the diplomacy as documented fact, and leaving the rest standing exactly where the 18th century left it, unexplained and unclaimed. Generations of professional historical method and the honest scholarly position on this man's beginnings is still, word for word, the pastor of Eckernförde's. Researchers have spent lifetimes trying to add to that list. The most dogged of them, an English writer named Jean Overton Fuller, spent years in the archives in the 1980s, chasing him through diplomatic files and parish records across half of Europe, and produced the fullest documentary biography anyone has managed. Her conclusion, after all that digging, was essentially the shape you have been listening to for the last several hours. A real man, gifted and secretive, probably born around the turn of the 18th century, probably connected to the Rákóczi wreckage, certainly a chemist and musician of genuine ability, certainly dead in Eckernförde in 1784. And around that real man, a second being, assembled by other hands after his death, wearing his name, doing things he never did, meeting people he never met, and growing, decade over decade, in exact proportion to how little could be proved about the original. The two of them share a name and nothing else, and by now the second one is far better documented than the first. Whole libraries exist about the master. The man fits in a folder. So go back, one last time, to the town where the folder closes. Stand in Eckernförde on a winter evening, if you ever get the chance, when the holiday crowds are gone, and the wind is coming off the Baltic the way it came for him in his last February. The harbour is a few minutes' walk from the church, past brick gables and fish smokehouses that were already old when they carried him through the streets. The town knows what it has, in its understated northern way. Local histories give him his chapter, guides mention him to tour groups between the smokehouses and the old town hall. And every so often a different sort of visitor turns up. Someone who has come a long way, asks quietly where tomb number 1 lies, and receives the only answer anyone can give, a gesture at the floor in general. Occult pilgrims have been making that trip for well over a century, and every one of them has gone home with the same nothing. The church is usually open. Inside, the air is still and cold, and the floor is stone, and under the stone, somewhere, in ground that was rented for 30 years and never renewed, lies a man who spent his entire existence making sure that no document and no witness could ever say for certain who he was. He succeeded completely. 2.5 centuries of digging, from parish clerks to prosecutors to professional historians, have gone into the question, and the question stands exactly where he left it. What remains is a line of church German in a parish book, written by a tired clerk on a March day in 1784, doing his honest best with an impossible entry. The so-called Count of Saint Germain, deceased. And below it, because the form required something and he had nothing, the 5 words that turned out to be the truest biography anyone would ever write of him. All right, that's the count. Before you click away, do me 2 small favors. First, comments. I want to know, if you could pull his trick and start over somewhere with a new name and no history, would you actually do it? Because I've been asking myself that all week, and I keep changing my answer. Second, if these videos are part of your nights, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships are what keep them coming. No sponsors, just you lot, and everything's linked in the description and the pinned comment. Nothing's owed though. You showing up is plenty. Sleep well, and mind who you meet at dinner.